In this video, we are going to talk about the Fujifilm GFX 100, which is an extremely unique camera. There really isn't much out there that you can compare this to. It is Fuji's flagship medium format camera with a 100 megapixel sensor, and it also has things like in-body image stabilization. It can record 4K video. Fujifilm were gracious enough to loan me a camera for a couple weeks. They also sent along two lenses, the GF 45mm f2.8 as well as the GF 63mm f2.8. Now, these are awesome lenses. They're great for testing, but this is the first medium format camera that we've had with in-body image stabilization, and it's an extremely high resolution. So I wanted to push it a little bit further, so I went ahead and rented two more lenses to go with this. And I got the GF 110mm f2 and the GF 120mm macro f4. So I want to dive down and show you some images, but first I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor this week, who are the awesome folks over at Skillshare.com. If you haven't seen Skillshare, you should check them out. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes on photography, film production, design, and many other creative fields. A premium membership will give you unlimited access to high-quality classes from experts in their fields. You can improve your skills, unlock new opportunities, and do the work that you love. This is a course that I actually highly recommend. I think is really well taught if you want to get a really good grasp on the fundamentals of digital photography. A lot of the concepts we're talking about in this video. This is a wonderful course that was put together by Justin Bridges, and if you want to understand how ISO impacts your image, what shutter speed and f-stop have to do with the final picture. If you want to understand focal length and field of view with lenses, I think this is a really good comprehensive guide. Skillshare is also one of the most affordable learning platforms out there. An annual subscription costs less than $10 a month. So if you head over to Skillshare using the link below in the description, you can get a 2-month free trial. So you've got absolutely nothing to lose or even purchase. So just go check out Skillshare today by using that link in the description. And I want to give a special shout out and thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this episode of The Art of Photography. So the Fujifilm GFX 100, I mentioned earlier, this is a really unique camera. And I say that because in the world of medium format, because the sensor is much larger than what you find in full frame, APS-C, Micro Four Thirds, or your phone, it's a bigger sensor. And as the sensor gets bigger, it becomes more difficult to do things with the ergonomics of the camera, with the way it functions, with heat dissipation, with the processing that goes on. And so medium format has typically been reserved as kind of a studio format. In other words, most of the cameras that have been made are studio cameras. And the GFX is kind of different in a lot of ways. Now, Hasselblad blew the doors wide open a couple years ago with the X1D when they made something that was extremely small that you could literally hand hold and you didn't have to drag a lot of equipment around. Now, that does create some limitations because of the body size. Make no mistake, this is a big camera. It is really big. There are two fans inside. There's a lot of stuff that has to go into that camera to get it to perform where it is, and they just did a really nice job of keeping the ergonomics as such to where it's really not a street photography camera, but you could use it that way if that's what you want to do. And this camera is extremely unique because it has features that you don't see in any other medium format camera. Things like in-body image stabilization. The speed of the autofocus is very impressive. Even the ability to record 4K video downsampled from 100 megapixels, the results are actually very impressive. But I have to say, the one thing that has me the most excited about the GFX 100 by far, I mean, those features are cool, but the sensor in this camera is one of the most beautiful that I've ever seen. It outputs 16-bit raw images, the dynamic range, the shadow detail. I mean, we're going to look at some images here because that is really the most important thing, and it's my favorite part of this camera. It's like those features made me really curious, but the image quality just won me over. So we're going to look at some images that I shot with the GFX 100. I am using Capture One for these examples. They will work in Lightroom too. I do recommend Capture One, particularly for this camera. This first image is this moody black and white image that I took with the 120 macro lens, and what you have is a very razor thin depth of field. And a couple things I want to show you about this. So first of all, I really didn't do a whole lot of editing to this image other than to turn into black and white. So this is how it looks when it came off camera. This is a cicada shell, actually. They kind of hatch out of this and turn into a different bug. I wanted to do something moody, so I wanted to render this in black and white, which I have done here. I did a little bit of color balancing, but this is pretty much straight off the camera. Now, if you look, I picked a little bit darker exposure for this because I wanted it to be moody. So there's really no highlights that are even anywhere near in danger of being blown out, but a lot of these shadow areas really just fade out to black. Let me show you the latitude of what you have to work with this camera because I think it's really impressive. So I'm just going to increase my shadow detail on the high dynamic range tab over here, and if I bring that all the way up, you're going to notice that it brightens up quite a bit. You don't lose any detail in these shadows. In fact, if I zoom in, you're also going to notice that there is very little noise. In fact, not any at all. And I've pushed these shadows a couple stops stops. This image was shot at ISO 100. Obviously, the more gain that you put onto the sensor, you are going to start to see some noise, and we'll come back to that in a second because there's another advantage to having a 100 megapixel sensor, but I'm going to go ahead and reset that. Other thing that I want to show you is focus detail. Now, this is kind of the deal. When you were shooting medium format, most cameras don't have any kind of image stabilization in the lens or the body. So there's a little bit of a rule of thumb that you want to keep in mind with your shutter speed if you don't want any shake in your picture. You don't want any motion blur. And so typically what that formula is that you want to take the focal length of your lens and double it, and that will be your minimum shutter speed. So for example, if you're using the 45 millimeter lens, you take 45, double that, that becomes 90. So 1/90th of a second is the slowest you want to go. You want to keep it above that, and that will avoid any camera shake. Now, the GFX 100 does have in-body image stabilization. I want to see how far I could push that. So this exposure was actually shot at 1/90th of a second, and this is a 120 millimeter lens. So my optimal shutter speed should be 240, but I wanted to push the in-body image stabilization to see how far it would go. It is actually very impressive. Now, this is a very shallow plane of focus, but when I zoom in here, you can tell I do, in fact, have sharp detail. There's some on this leaf up here, too. This image was shot at 1/75th of a second. Remember, our optimal shutter speed should be no slower than 1/240th of a second. I'm clear down at 1/75th of a second. And if I zoom all the way in, you're going to notice that this is probably about as far as I can push it. You do have a little bit of motion blur. This image would be a lot sharper if I weren't hand holding it, if it were locked off on a tripod. But having said that, the in-body image stabilization is actually pretty impressive. Now, it would probably be very different if you were on a smaller sensor. So for instance, full frame, micro four thirds, for instance, a cell phone. Obviously, wider angle lenses give you a lot more latitude and you're going to notice a lot less blur, but I'm pretty impressed with these examples. And while you may think, well, at 1/75th of a second, you should be able to handhold that. Well, it is a 120 macro lens and I was in a weird angle. Anyway, I'm going to give you another example of dynamic range here. This is an image that was shot at a much higher ISO setting. This is ISO of 1600, and you're going to see that if I bump up the shadow detail on my HDR slider here, we can recover an enormous amount of shadow detail. However, at 1600, even when you start to recover this much, you are pushing it, and you're going to notice that in some of these darker areas, you start to see a little bit of noise. Now, this is still very impressive at 1600, but my point in showing this to you is that you get an enormous amount of flexibility, and another thing that comes into play is the fact that this is a full 100 megapixel sensor, so it depends on what your final output is going to be. You can actually get away with higher ISO settings, and you're not going to perceive as much noise because you have a much higher resolution image. There's a lot of stuff you can work with on this camera, and I'm telling you, this is one of my favorite sensors that I've ever shot on. It's not the same sensor, obviously, that Sony did, the 50 megapixel version that everyone used. So the Hasselblad X1D, the Fuji GFX 50S, the GFX 50R, those all use the same Sony sensor. This is a new design sensor, and not only is it a much higher resolution at 100 megapixels, but it has some of the most gorgeous dynamic range of any sensor that I've used. It rivals Phase One in terms of what it'll do with dynamic range. Another thing that I really loved is not that this was a great shot, but this was really high contrast, and I ended up just exposing for the highlights in here because I didn't want those to blow out. Again, I was on the road with this camera. I hadn't really been able to inspect the files yet, so I was playing it super safe, and so I didn't want to have to recover any highlight detail. But the shadow detail, not only do you have the detail, but these dark tones that come in here, and you can still separate. I mean, you know, on a lot of sensors, it just swallows all this to black when you get to those extremes, and the way this performs is just simply outstanding. And another thing that's really cool is to see what kind of detail you're working with at 100 megapixels. And I'll give you an example here. This is an image that was shot at Dogfish Head, which is one of my favorite breweries. It is in Delaware, and I went to visit, and I had the GFX 100 with me, and these are some kegs. This is suspended above the ground, probably about 60 feet or so, and forklifts will come. These are just these massive storage units that they have here. And so, you know, I'm standing on the bridge over here shooting this, and let's say you wanted to read this barcode in here. Maybe you could do it. Let's zoom in and see. Yes, I think I could scan that barcode. I mean, the resolution that you get out of 100 megapixels is just simply stunning. I have worked with 100 megapixel cameras before, mainly the Phase One. It's just a very different kind of camera, and that one actually has a slightly bigger sensor, even though it's still classified. They're all kind of called medium format. But what Fujifilm have been able to do with this camera is rivaling some of the more expensive offerings that I've seen. Another example is these pipes, and these run all over the brewery, and they have various liquids in them and go all kinds of places, and it's hard to really really tell, they're all labeled, what they do. If I just simply zoom in to 100 megapixels at 100%, you can read them pretty clearly. Anyway, it's pretty amazing what you can do with that kind of resolution. Another fun one is this beach scene. Now, one of the things that I will typically do with lenses when I'm testing a system for sharpness, whether that be the lenses and or the sensors, I will do it at several different apertures to try to find the sweet spot on the lens. And this was with the 45 millimeter f2.8. I found that the sweet spot's about f8 for just maximum sharpness. And again, when you go into this image and check out some of the detail on here, this is super sharp, and I didn't add any sharpening in post whatsoever. Kind of the ultimate creepy spy camera in a way, but like I can see exactly what the lifeguard's doing in this image, and if I zoom all the way out, you can see how far exactly I was from him. One of the really curious things that Fujifilm have done with the GFX 100 is this camera, to me, represents almost an interruption in the medium format market, and I want to talk about what I mean by that. So medium format cameras typically, historically, have been specialty cameras. They're very expensive, they're kind of big, bulky, they don't have a lot of the features that you have on smaller sensor cameras, but they also don't sell in those types of numbers. They're specialty. It's a niche audience of pro photographers who really need that kind of resolution, people doing technical photography. It's got its own market, and what Fujifilm and I think Hasselblad also in the last couple of years have done is they've started to interrupt that. I think you saw it with the Fujifilm GFX 50S, the 50R, the Hasselblad X1D, now the X1D2. Hasselblad have a modular system that they're looking at that's coming out, and so this is kind of representing a bit of a change in what has existed before, and it's going to be interesting to see where this goes, because the most curious thing about all this is the price point. They brought this camera in at $10,000. Now, $10,000 is still a big chunk of change. I mean, you can buy at least 7 XT3s and have money left over for lenses for that same cost. And so it's still kind of going to, I think, serve a niche, and will it be something that people really want to use? But to offer something that is considerably less expensive than what we've seen from Phase One and even Hasselblad with the higher end cameras for that matter, this represents a big change. It's going to be interesting to see where this goes. Is it going to be something that people are going to pick up on enough and the sales numbers are going to be to where this is a camera that is able to even come down further in price? Time will tell, but I think this is a really interesting start. I'm going to do more videos on this camera. I only had it for 2 weeks, like I mentioned, which was a very short amount of time, especially with my vacation in the middle, and I took it with me and shot anyway. But I did talk to Fujifilm about that. We're going to try and get another camera for a little bit longer time this fall. So if there's anything else you guys would like to see me cover, I did do some video on this camera, which I did not have any expectation of this being a video camera at all, and it was actually surprisingly good. I just did a couple little clips, and it was, considering you're downsizing from 100 megapixels, there's a lot of techniques involved to do that, and usually the image quality just doesn't look that great. You would want a full frame camera, or that's why you can get away with micro four thirds. You only need about 12 megapixels for 4K video. So I was really impressed with that. If there's something you'd like to see on this camera, drop me a comment below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.